Our next speaker is Professor Roger Jones. Professor Jones joined Victoria University in 2009 after working for CSIRO for 13 years. Roger works on climate change, interdisciplinary teams that aim to bridge science, economics and policy to understand the climate change risk and seek strategies to mitigate and adapt to the risks. Roger contributes to a range of international projects concerning climate change and was a convening lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 4th and 5th assessments. Roger's topic this afternoon is assessing the economic value of green infrastructure. Please welcome Roger Jones.
Thanks very much for the invitation to speak this afternoon, and I'll have to apologise to John for not capitalising the first letter of his name, and I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors in some of this work. So today what I'd like to do is just to talk a little bit about some of the broad thinking behind green infrastructure, how that compares with grey infrastructure, and some of the challenges that we face when we try and bring economic arguments to bear to justify the importance of green infrastructure and trees in particular. So one of the big differences between grey, ordinary and green infrastructure is that one's single purpose. You build roads for traffic, you build drains for water to run down, nothing else lives in it. But green infrastructure is multi-purpose. It tends to be resilient, soft rather than hard. It often needs to grow, so you've got to let it grow for a while before you get your maximum benefits from it. And it gives you a whole range of benefits that can contribute to the economy, but they're also social and environmental. Economics doesn't have a lot of pegs for some of those values. And we can also think of them as maybe a new technology. So it's not just a road, is it? But of course these days, if we put it across a safety committee, we can't let the kiddies near them, which is a bit of a shame. But we do get all sorts of benefits from these trees. So we've got stormwater benefits, wildlife. They're absolutely brilliant at directing water. Until recently, there was a theory that trees, capillary action actually can't move water vertically beyond about 20 metres. And there was a question as to how do trees do that. Science has discovered carbon nanotubes, and it turns out that trees have discovered them a lot earlier than science has. And so, you know, as we learn more about sort of technology and mimicking nature in our technology, we go back and look at nature and we just start to uncover more and more functions and things that it does. And so there are all of these amazing and wonderful benefits we can get from this. This is only a small sample. How do we value those? And we also have a bunch of attributes which are actually really useful. Quality, how healthy and biodiverse is an area? How well connected is it? It makes our urban areas in particular permeable instead of hard and just getting rid of water as soon as it falls. How physically diverse is it for habitat and various other things? How sustainable? And all of these, of course, contribute to resilience, and resilience is something we value, but is very, very difficult to measure. So we know if we can build it, we can grow it. It's useful. The three main benefits, areas of benefits for green infrastructure, of course, are economic, direct to the economy, environmental and social. And in terms of using conventional economics to measure these sorts of things, if we're looking at social benefits, say a cooler city, an environment that people want to exercise in, that kind of thing, we can look at substituted costs for health, so healthier people have fewer doctors and hospital bills. There's environmental quality, improved mental health, community connectivity, cultural richness and tolerance. And so we can begin to see that trying to put these numbers into a cost-benefit analysis are going to be a little bit tricky. We also have different levels of benefit. Conventional economics really looks at what is called utility to the individual. So the idea is that you've got a bunch of different choices that you can use your money or resources from, and you trade off between those to get the best personal benefit for yourself. And really, most of economics is actually upscaled from that. And we certainly can see some direct market benefits from trees. We've heard some of those today, that they will increase the value of adjacent properties and all sorts of things like that. But then we have community values. And if we ask a community what they value, and there's more and more evidence for this collecting, they actually give different answers to individuals. So communities value neighbourhoods very, very highly. And the City of Melbourne and various other councils, but City of Melbourne in particular, have done that through some of their community consultation. And one of the exercises they did recently was to go back to the community, to set up community forum and ask them to help prioritise their budget. And one of the big choices that the community made was that they wanted expenditure on local environments, on more of the urban forest, more of this tree planting. So again, we're looking at different sorts of values and measuring values that conventional economics doesn't handle well. The other thing are institutional benefits, and these are also extremely important, but often are things we don't turn into dollars. So the fact that we value human lives or nature, we have laws, conservation laws, the way that local government is structured to service the community, these are all institutional values. And again, by developing and growing green infrastructure, we can satisfy some of those. And then we're looking at where those benefits accrue. If we're improving health outcomes, for instance, and we just heard the example from that from David, the health department will be involved. We can direct the benefits to them because that fulfills their policy. So in terms of who potential investors in this might be and who the potential beneficiaries, it's not just people and markets, it's really communities and institutions. And one of the things that we do when we're looking at green infrastructure is that we can sort of say, well, who's contributing to these sorts of things and who are the beneficiaries? And when we get into institutional values, when we're talking about people and rights and things like that, it becomes very ethics-based. So we do these things as a society because we think they're right and they're correct. There are lots of different benefits in green infrastructure. You've heard a lot of these today, so I'll just flip through them. Of course, there are a whole heap of health benefits. Some of these direct, some of them are indirect, just in terms of human welfare. We know there are very strong relationships between mental well-being and green infrastructure, but we are having trouble putting numbers on those sorts of things to quantify that. The urban heat island, which we've just heard about, climate modification, water management is critically important within the cities, urban ecology for four, and food production. And it might not actually be the jewels or the sustenance in terms of food production, but it might just be a lot of the social bonding and things like that that you get. Anytime community gardens are opened up in cities and well serviced, they usually have more people want to join those gardens than they have space to allocate. So they're very popular and very valuable. What we've had over the past development over the past 15 years is there's been attempts to actually put all of these into a framework that's called total economic value, which actually accounts for all of those benefits we've just gone through and more. And they can be divided into use values, the things that you get direct benefit from, and non-use values, the things that are there that you value, but you may actually not get personal gain from those. they're quite complex. So they can be direct use of goods and services. Honey and fruit are good examples of that. Secondary benefits in terms of carbon sequestration or stormwater control. Environmental options. One is that we can often use the chemistry of out of plants, vegetation and things like that. But the other is that if we actually destroy or remove an ecologically or an environmentally important area, it's actually really difficult to replace. Bequest and altruistic values. So all Australians value the Great Barrier Reef, but not necessarily for themselves. They value it for the nation and for the people of the world. And existence values. It has a right to exist. And these range from directly within market, from the top, right down to ethical values at the bottom. So when we're actually trying to get the total economic value from all of these, it's not really worth trying to convert it all into dollars and to get one big number. So there have been attempts to do that. So what we're looking at are frameworks where we can put into market or market equivalent things for direct use and secondary benefits, but then we're looking for other tools and frameworks that we can use to measure things like options, community benefits, and the value of ethics in terms of the environment. So total economic value is actually a really useful accounting tool, and that's largely what it's being used for. It's not a great economic tool, and that's where we're looking at what we can develop and what we can build from that. And tangible values, the market ones, they're rather much easier than these intangibles that are much more difficult to handle. So what I'll just go through and we'll have a look at how some of these sit in the city and what we know about them at the moment. And so in terms of the economics, we can say, well, yes, the tangible values sit in the economy, but we've got a whole bunch of social and ecological values that sit outside those. And a good example are environmental options. So there's uncertainty about future needs. One of those is related to climate change. If we think we are going to need a more resilient landscape in the future because climate change risks are going to increase, say for instance droughts become more harsh, it becomes hotter, we have larger downpours, then there's actually an insurance value to having healthy ecosystems in the future. And so we actually don't want to remove those and replace them with hard infrastructure. We might want to keep those soft values there. Usually options are treated the other way. We look at land with trees and things like that on it, flora and fauna as being undeveloped, and it only is worth something when we develop it. Environmental options are a way where we look at the future value of what the environment is worth to us. And there's also this irreversibility. We're looking at complex ecosystems are very difficult to replace, so there's a cost if we take a step that can't be reversed. We also have acquired value. So and we've heard a lot about that today. Older trees, things that have got a history, things that have got a story to them. So we will plant some trees, but people see them, they have this history which gets more and more valuable over time. And so, of course, this is the Fitzroy Gardens in Melbourne, has now got more than 150-year history on it. Its acquired value is very, very high. What was interesting about the history of Melbourne was that the acquired values of these parks were pretty much settled in the 19th century. There was some land sold in Albert Park in the late 1900s. The public outcry was such that it wasn't tried again. So from very early on, having established those grand parks, those open areas, people valued them greatly, and there haven't been any governments who've wanted to carve into them too much since. Some of the difficulties that we do have with conventional economics is how we value the future when we're using economic tools. So one of those is through discounting. And that's sort of saying, well, what's something worth today and what would the same thing be worth in 10, 20 or 50 years' time? And so in government policy, we have something called the social discount rate. And that is supposed to be the return on benefits that we do for implementing something that gives benefits to society, say infrastructure, it can be conventional or green, and those services, health services, come back to us with a social discount rate. And it means that if you've got something that's worth $1 today, depending on whether you've got a 1% discount rate, in 50 years it would be worth about 70 cents. At 3.5 it would be worth about 18 cents, and at 5% it would be worth about 9 cents in 50 years' time. So there's a question of how do we as a society actually value green infrastructure, trees and things like that, and how do economists value it, and are those two things compatible? So there are reasons as to why we might want to discount various things rather quickly or rather slowly. If we've got a computer, we might assume that it's going to last for 5 years. So I buy a computer, it's going to depreciate at about 20% a year, and then I might need to buy another one if I wanted. A car might depreciate in about 10 years. A house, if I don't renovate it or do anything, might last 50 or 100 years. So we already know that when we look at different goods and services, we discount them at different rates. And the other thing we're doing with green infrastructure, trees and things like that, is that we're actually growing them. So if we plant a tree, it's going to take some time for that canopy to grow. And the benefits that we see from that, say the interception of stormwater or catching pollutants on its leaves, will actually grow over time. And so this is a model of a hackberry tree, which is related to elms and various things like that in the US. And if we have no discounting in terms of the stormwater benefits, they accrue quite greatly over time. If we include some form of discounting, 3% or 5%, we still get values returning from those, but rather much more slowly. So what sort of discount rates are used in Australia? And this gets really interesting. So what we have here are two social discount rates. One is from the Australian Office of Best Practice Regulation, who you've probably not heard of, but they're a mob in Canberra. And they have a set of recommended discount rates, very long term, that they would like people to use for costing public policy. Below we have the UK Treasury Green Book, and if you have a look at the discount rates, they have periods of years 1 to 30, 31 to 75. The Australian discount rate at the start is 7% a year. The UK discount rate is 3.5%. So it's roughly double. After 300 years, the Australian recommended discount rate is 3.7. The UK discount rate is 1%. So what that suggests is if we have a park in Australia and one in the UK, the one in Australia depreciates at about double the rate. Now, is that because our trees senesce twice as quickly or anything like that, or is that just a political and a social artefact? And so in practical terms, and this sort of discounting is supposed to be used for long-term problems like climate change, and the UK Treasury Green Book was that used by Stern in the Stern report. So if we have a look at the practical effects of that, let's say we've got an asset worth $1 million at the beginning, and we look at the UK futures for that, it depreciates at this rate. The Australian depreciation means that after 100 years, it's worth almost nothing. The UK example is not much better. After 500 years, if you do this on a spreadsheet, you're down to about 8 significant figures in a decimal of less than 1 cent, by the time you've got that. Now, we know that when we plan a botanic gardens or something like that, when we're looking at managing old growth forests that have got trees that are 400 or 500 years old, we don't discount them this fast. You know, for all practical purposes. So the numbers we're using for public policy are completely different to the practical assumptions we use when we think about this sort of stuff. So the economics is actually not being a useful tool for us in this situation. If we also say, well, we might get some benefits, some social benefits from that park, this is roughly 5%, 2.5% return a year, immediate, and 2.5% growing. So like that tree example, it takes about 40 years to get going. After 100 years, using the Australian example, you would have only made about 45%, according to this cost-benefit model, of your initial investment back. But in the UK example, you would have paid for it in about 88 years. So when we look at the way that we cost conventional infrastructure and do cost-benefit on public policy, and we apply those sorts of tools to long-lived green infrastructure that we apply, socially we apply very low discount rates to, because we do plan for them to live for long periods into the future. The current tools are actually mismatched to that. And this is one of the reasons why when we take these arguments to Treasury and to Finance and we apply their tools, these things come out second best. But when we go and talk to the community and we ask them what they want, they come out first best. So there's an issue here, and this is one of the things that we're looking at in terms of some of the work that we're doing. So again, acquired value. We could make the suggestion that if we had cost-benefit analysis in the 19th century, we might not have built these parks. We might not have built Melbourne's water supply system with the closed catchments, because we might have said using cost-benefit analysis we could make more money putting into housing. So again, some of the tools that we've now locked in to make decisions for in the modern world actually don't make a lot of sense. So we have shared assets, common goods and institutions. And one of the things that we're doing is sort of exploring various tools and means that we can make much better arguments with these, and not to discount them in the way that we might. And especially when we get to local government and when we look at who's responsible for these things, in terms of green infrastructure, and earlier today we had the example of Vic Roads does not recognise the grand assets that they have along the sides of their roads. And if they did, it would probably double or triple their asset base. But that's not being recognised. But then there's a downside to that, because if you recognise it, then you need to maintain it in good condition. So we know we can get a lot of value through resilient infrastructure. If we make the city more resilient, if we make it greener, if we improve the habitat both for people, for plants and animals, that it will cope better with climate extremes, that it will be a place where people want to visit and a place where they want to live. Over the long term, we also know that the flow in benefits back into the economy will be sustained on an ongoing basis. So if people are living there, we already know that with Melbourne, there's cultural tourism here, there's tourism because of the European style city and the way people visit and reasons that they come from here. Again, our models for doing that aren't great, but they are much better than the cost-benefit analysis for the East-West link. And one of the areas that I think we haven't looked at anywhere near enough for this is to look between the link between nature and human welfare. So there's always been this thought that environmental arguments were anti-human and what have you, that old sort. In reality, they're actually very closely intertwined. So if you look at the healthy city, the really healthy city, you've got active participation, lots of open space, places where people can go, commune, share, things like that, down to the sort of place where you might go to die, Lots of grey infrastructure, hard surfaces, windy, cold, wet, hot, all of those sorts of things. And then we look at urban green infrastructure, we can see that we can have a fully connected city with a mix of amenity, ecology and activity, integrated grey and green infrastructure. In Singapore, for instance, whenever they build public infrastructure, they have to build a green component in it, and it has to be a public space. 2 rules they work by. Down to where we've just got a few weeds in pavement and little open space, hard surfaces and things like that. And of course these things can interact and integrate. And in terms of sort of integrating human welfare within cities and social welfare, given that people are becoming increasingly more urbanised, this is where our economic understanding needs to go to. It needs to be able to integrate these things properly. It needs to be able to think and to work over the long term. Our current tools in use aren't up to it, but we still need to be able to go back to Treasury and make arguments that make sense to them. So we're kind of trying to bridge this, building hybrid models and approaches using some numbers, some argument, so on and so forth. So where we are at the moment, we've got some snakes that social welfare is not seen as important as the economy. And we've got some ladders that communities really do value these assets, that we know that benefits accrue over long periods of time and they can be substantial. And I think some of our effort now is to really see if we can reconcile these and build some better economics that are more suited to purpose. So thank you.